The flight was just another regular day for the cabin crew, but for the passengers, it was special. Everyone on that flight was excited, especially those sitting in first class. They had no idea that they would soon share the same cabin with one of the world's most humble and beloved actors, Keanu Reeves. Keanu was not the type of celebrity who entered a room with flashing lights or loud announcements. He was quiet, soft-spoken, and almost invisible when he wanted to be. He carried himself in such a modest way that, if you didn't look twice, you might mistake him for an ordinary traveler. That day was no different. He walked into the airport wearing a simple jacket, jeans, and sneakers. Nothing fancy, nothing loud. His hair was a little messy, and he carried just one bag slung over his shoulder. To anyone watching, he seemed like just another man catching a flight. But there was something about him that still drew attention. His calm presence, his polite smile, and the quiet way he moved, all of it made people turn their heads, even if they couldn't figure out why. As he approached the boarding gate, a few passengers recognized him. They whispered softly to each other, nudging their friends and pointing in his direction. But Keanu didn't notice. He wasn't the type to put on dark glasses or act secretive. Instead, he nodded politely to the staff, said thank you when they checked his ticket, and quietly made his way into the aircraft. When Keanu stepped into first class, some of the passengers sitting there glanced up in surprise. They expected first-class travelers to be dressed in expensive suits or elegant dresses, showing off watches, rings, and designer bags. Keanu, however, walked in with an old leather bag and a very modest appearance. The only piece of jewelry he wore was a small necklace that hung around his neck. It was not made of shining gold or diamonds. It was not something a jeweler would advertise in a glass case. In fact, it looked quite simple, almost ordinary. The chain was thin, and the pendant was small, slightly worn out, as if it had been with him for many years. Most people wouldn't notice it at all. But to Keanu, that necklace meant more than anything money could buy. It carried a story, a memory, and a deep connection to his past. He found his seat near the window and placed his bag in the overhead compartment. He didn't rush, didn't fuss, and didn't demand special treatment. Instead, he waited for the people in front of him, helped an older passenger who was struggling with her luggage, and then sat down with a quiet smile. The other passengers observed him with curiosity. Some were surprised that such a famous Hollywood star was traveling without an assistant, without a security guard, and without the air of importance that usually surrounded celebrities. But Keanu had always been different. As the cabin crew moved around, one flight attendant in particular noticed him. She was young, energetic, and very confident in her job. She liked to keep the atmosphere light with jokes and small talk. But sometimes, her humor crossed the line without her realizing it. As she walked past Keanu, her eyes landed on his necklace. To her, it seemed unusual that a man sitting in first class, especially a celebrity, would wear something so plain and ordinary. She didn't know its story. She didn't know its value in Keanu's heart. All she saw was a necklace that didn't match the luxury around her. Keanu, however, didn't notice her expression. He was busy pulling out a book from his bag. He loved to read during flights, finding peace in the quiet hours above the clouds. As he opened his book, he leaned back and gave a small sigh of relief, glad to finally settle into his seat. Other passengers in first class were buzzing quietly. Some had spotted him and were debating whether to ask for a photo. Others were stealing glances at him, whispering about his movies, and remarking on how simple he looked in person. The air was filled with curiosity, admiration, and a little excitement. Keanu, though, stayed calm. He had traveled enough times to know how to disappear into his seat. He didn't mind being noticed, but he also never acted like he deserved special treatment. He was, after all, just another person on a plane heading to his destination. But as much as he wanted the flight to be peaceful, life had its way of throwing unexpected moments into his path. What seemed like a normal journey was about to turn into a story that people would remember for years. The necklace, resting lightly against his shirt, was about to become the center of attention. And while Keanu knew its meaning, the others didn't. For him, it was a piece of his heart, a reminder of someone dear, and a way to keep a memory alive. For the flight attendant who noticed it, however, it was just an odd choice for a first-class passenger. In that quiet first hour of boarding, no one could have guessed that this small piece of jewelry would spark an incident that would test kindness, humility, and respect. The cabin crew moved quickly, passengers settled into their seats, and the engines prepared to roar. The stage was set for an unexpected encounter, one that would remind everyone on board that appearances can be deceiving, and that behind every object lies a story untold. And so, with the seatbelt signs flashing and the plane ready for takeoff, Keanu sat calmly by the window, unaware that his necklace, the simple, unshining piece of jewelry, was about to create a moment that would travel far beyond the walls of that airplane. The airplane had taken off smoothly, and the cabin lights in first class were warm and gentle. Passengers had settled in, some reading newspapers, some working on their laptops, and others simply leaning back to enjoy the comfort of the spacious seats. Everything looked calm, but for one flight attendant, her attention kept going back to a certain passenger, Keanu Reeves. She had recognized him, of course. Almost everyone knew his face, his movies, and his reputation as one of Hollywood's most respected actors. But instead of being starstruck, she found herself puzzled. Something about him didn't match her idea of what a world-famous celebrity should look like. He wasn't covered in designer clothes, he wasn't wearing a luxury watch, and he wasn't trying to show off in any way. His entire look was simple, even ordinary. And then there was that necklace. To her eyes, the necklace seemed too plain, too ordinary for someone sitting in first class. It looked almost like something a teenager might wear, or something picked up from a street stall, not something belonging to a millionaire actor. The flight attendant, with her sharp tongue and quick humor, decided to make a comment. She thought it would be light-hearted, even funny. She believed passengers might laugh, and perhaps Keanu himself would smile politely. What she didn't realize was that this moment would stay with her long after the flight had landed. As she approached his seat with the drink cart, she smiled brightly. "Good afternoon, sir," she said in her professional tone. Keanu looked up from his book, smiled back, and nodded. "Good afternoon," he replied softly, his voice calm and gentle. She poured his drink and handed it to him. But instead of moving along like she usually would, she lingered for a second. Her eyes went straight to the small necklace that rested on his chest, half hidden under his shirt. And then, without thinking twice, she spoke. "That's a very interesting necklace," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge. A couple of nearby passengers glanced up, curious about her tone. Keanu simply nodded, still smiling politely. "Thank you," he said, as if he didn't notice the undertone. But the flight attendant wasn't done. She tilted her head, pretending to be playful, and added, "I must say, I didn't expect to see something like that in first class. Most people here wear something a little more expensive, you know." There was a small pause. The words hung in the air. A few passengers chuckled quietly, not sure if they were supposed to laugh or feel uncomfortable. One man across the aisle looked at her with raised eyebrows, as if to say, "Did she really just say that?" Keanu, however, didn't flinch. He took a sip of his drink, placed it gently on the tray table, and looked back at her with the same kind smile. "It's special to me," he said simply. His voice was calm, steady, and without a hint of anger. The flight attendant forced a laugh, hoping to ease the awkwardness. "Well, if it's special, that's what matters, right?" she said, before moving on to the next passenger. But the moment didn't disappear. It lingered in the air, leaving some passengers uncomfortable. A woman sitting nearby leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Why would she say that?" The husband shook his head. Another passenger muttered softly, "That wasn't very nice." But Keanu didn't seem bothered. He went back to his book, turning the page with the same calmness he had before. Inside, though, the necklace carried memories so deep that words like those could have hurt if they came from anyone else. But Keanu had lived long enough, and with enough wisdom, to know that people often speak without understanding. He knew that anger wasn't the answer. Silence, grace, and patience, those were his choices. Still, the flight attendant's words didn't go unnoticed. A senior crew member who had been working nearby caught the exchange. She had flown with Keanu before and knew of his reputation for being humble and kind. She also knew the young flight attendant's habit of speaking too freely, thinking humor would cover her words. Later, when the drink service was over, the senior crew member quietly pulled her aside. "Be careful," she whispered. "That's Keanu Reeves. And that necklace might mean something important to him. You shouldn't joke like that." The young attendant brushed it off. "Oh, come on," she said. "It was just a comment." He didn't even seem to mind. But the truth was, others had noticed. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others whispering about how rude the comment had sounded. And slowly, the flight attendant began to realize that maybe her joke hadn't landed the way she thought. Meanwhile, Keanu continued reading, completely unshaken on the surface. But in his heart, the necklace was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a memory, a piece of love, a reminder of someone he had lost but carried with him always. He had worn it for years, never taking it off, no matter the occasion. To him, it wasn't about appearance, it was about meaning. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the earlier comment still lingered like a faint echo. A few passengers kept sneaking glances at him, perhaps expecting him to react or say something sharp in return. But he never did. Instead, he turned another page in his book, his face calm, his manner peaceful. This quiet response, though unnoticed by some, was beginning to speak louder than any words could. Passengers were starting to see the difference between a man who carried himself with dignity and an attendant who had let her tongue slip. The rest of the cabin service continued, but the young flight attendant couldn't shake a strange feeling. She thought about the way Keanu had answered her with kindness, not with anger. She replayed the moment in her mind and began to feel a hint of guilt. It was subtle at first, but it grew with every glance she caught from other passengers. What she didn't know yet was that the necklace carried a story she couldn't have imagined. A story of family, love, and memory. A story that would soon come to light and leave her feeling the weight of her words more deeply than she ever expected. For now, though, the cabin remained calm. Keanu sat quietly, the book resting in his hands, the necklace still visible on his chest, and the other passengers continued their journey. But the seed had been planted. The moment that began with a careless comment would soon grow into something much bigger, something that would remind everyone on board about the power of respect, humility, and the unseen stories carried by the simplest objects. And as the plane soared high above the clouds, the necklace gleamed softly in the light, holding secrets that no one else yet knew. The hours of the flight moved slowly, as they usually did on long journeys. Most passengers in first class had settled into their routines. Some leaned back with their eyes closed, drifting into a light sleep. Others tapped away on laptops, busy with work. A few watched movies on the built-in screens, trying to pass the time. But one passenger kept drawing attention, not because he wanted it, but simply because of who he was. Keanu Reeves, sitting quietly by the window, was in his own world. His book rested open in his hands, but every now and then, he would pause, look out the window at the endless clouds, and gently touch the necklace hanging around his neck. The flight attendant who had commented on it earlier noticed this. Each time she passed by, her eyes landed on that necklace again. At first, she had only thought of it as something unremarkable, something that didn't belong in first class. But now, she began to sense that perhaps she had been wrong. Why did he keep reaching for it? Why did he look at it with such quiet emotion in his eyes? It wasn't long before another crew member, the senior attendant who had earlier warned her, shared more about the actor with her. She leaned closer when the cabin was calm and whispered, "Do you even know what that necklace means to him?" The younger attendant frowned, curious. "No, I just thought it looked simple." The older attendant sighed. "I heard from a colleague years ago that the necklace belonged to his mother. She gave it to him when he was young. It's the only piece of jewelry he really wears. He never talks about it much, but people say it's priceless to him, not in money, but in memory." The younger attendant froze. Her heart sank a little. The words she had spoken earlier now replayed in her mind, only this time they sounded harsh, even cruel. She had joked about something that wasn't just an accessory, it was part of his heart. Meanwhile, Keanu sat in silence, his thoughts drifting. The necklace carried him back to a different time, to memories of his mother. She had been his strength, his supporter, and his guiding light in his early life. When she gave him that necklace, she had told him, "This is so you'll always carry a part of me with you, no matter where you go." Those words had stayed with him. Years had passed, movies had come and gone, fame had grown and quieted, but the necklace remained with him always. It was scratched now, its shine long gone, but for Keanu, every scratch carried a story. Every time he touched it, he felt connected to her again, as though she were still walking beside him. The younger attendant, now aware of this truth, began to see her earlier joke in a different light. She had thought she was being funny, making a light-hearted remark to entertain passengers. Instead, she had mocked something deeply personal. She started to feel uneasy. Some of the passengers had already noticed the shift in the atmosphere. A woman seated across from Keanu had overheard the conversation earlier and now leaned slightly toward him. "I just want to say," she whispered softly, "I think your necklace is beautiful. Sometimes the things that mean the most to us aren't the ones that shine the brightest." Keanu turned to her, his eyes warm with gratitude, and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said gently. His calm voice carried a weight that made the woman smile warmly in return. The attendant, watching this exchange, felt her cheeks grow warm. She realized that while she had used her words carelessly, others could still see the truth that Keanu's necklace was more than an ornament. It was a symbol of love and remembrance. Hours went by, but the guilt grew heavier in her heart. She remembered the way passengers had looked at her after her comment, the way some had frowned. She remembered the soft chuckle from a few people, but now even that felt wrong. They hadn't been laughing with her, they had been laughing out of discomfort. Keanu, however, gave no sign of holding a grudge. He continued reading, resting, and occasionally offering small smiles to those around him. His calmness made her guilt even stronger. If he had been angry, if he had snapped at her, she might have defended herself. But his kindness left her with nothing but her own conscience. At one point, she noticed him quietly helping another passenger again. An older man was struggling to reach his bag in the overhead compartment. Keanu stood up, reached easily, and handed it over with a polite smile. The man thanked him, clearly surprised at the gesture, and Keanu simply nodded, sitting back down without making a scene. The younger attendant thought to herself, "How can someone so famous be so humble? And how could I have been so thoughtless?" As the plane flew over endless miles of sky, the atmosphere in first class slowly shifted. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier exchange now looked at Keanu with even more admiration. They whispered softly about his patience, his humility, and his quiet strength. For the younger attendant, the hours became heavier. She knew she needed to apologize, but every time she thought of approaching him, her words stuck in her throat. She imagined what he might say, how he might look at her. But more than that, she imagined how her careless words had hurt him, even if he hadn't shown it. Inside her mind, she replayed her comment again and again. "Didn't expect to see something like that in first class." The sentence sounded crueler each time. She wished she could take it back. What she didn't realize was that Keanu wasn't thinking about her words anymore. For him, the moment had passed. He had chosen kindness over reaction. He knew people often judged without understanding. He had seen it many times before in his career and in life. To him, what mattered was staying true to himself, staying connected to what was important, and not letting small things disturb his peace. But for the attendant, it became a quiet lesson that she couldn't ignore. She began to see not just Keanu, but every passenger differently. She wondered what stories they carried with them, what objects in their lives might look ordinary on the outside but held extraordinary meaning inside. As the flight continued, the necklace remained in its place, shining softly in the dim cabin light. Some saw only a small piece of jewelry, but now many in the cabin began to see it as a reminder of something larger: love, memory, and the stories hidden behind appearances. The younger attendant, now restless, knew she would need to find the courage to make things right. But she also knew that no matter what she said, the lesson had already been written into her heart. And so, the plane continued its long journey through the night sky, passengers asleep, clouds rolling below, and one necklace silently telling its story without words. It had already touched hearts, even before its full meaning was revealed. The flight was now halfway through its long journey. The sky outside the windows was dark, painted with streaks of moonlight. Inside the cabin, the lights were dimmed, and most passengers had drifted into sleep. The quiet hum of the engines filled the silence, a steady reminder that they were thousands of feet above the earth. Keanu Reeves sat by the window, still calm, still humble, as if the world outside had no effect on his peace. He had closed his book by now and rested his hands gently on his lap. From time to time, his fingers brushed against the necklace hanging softly against his chest. It was a simple gesture, but to him, it meant everything. Across the aisle, the younger flight attendant shifted in her seat near the galley. The more she thought about her earlier comment, the heavier her heart grew. She replayed the moment again and again, wishing she could go back in time. She had thought her words were harmless, maybe even funny, but now they sounded sharp in her memory. She had touched something she didn't understand. Passengers who had noticed the moment earlier were still whispering quietly about Keanu's grace. One couple spoke softly, "Did you see how kind he was? Anyone else would have been upset." Another replied, "That's why people respect him so much. He's different." These words reached the attendant's ears, and her cheeks warmed with shame. She realized that the world was seeing the contrast: her carelessness against his calmness. Finally, unable to hold the guilt inside anymore, she decided to approach him. She waited until the cabin was quiet, then slowly walked toward his seat. Her hands felt cold, her heart beat a little faster. She wasn't sure what she would say, but she knew she had to say something. Keanu looked up as she stopped beside him. His eyes, warm and gentle, met hers. There was no anger in them, no judgment. Just patience. That made it even harder for her to speak. "Mr. Reeves," she began softly, almost whispering so the other passengers wouldn't hear. I wanted to apologize." She paused, her voice shaking slightly. "Earlier, when I commented on your necklace. I shouldn't have said that. It was unprofessional, and it was unkind. I'm very sorry." There was silence for a moment. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying her face. Then, with that same calm tone he had carried the entire flight, he said, "It's all right. Really. Don't worry about it." But she shook her head. "No, it's not all right. I realize now that I judged something without knowing its meaning. And I feel terrible for that. I didn't mean to hurt you." Keanu gave her a small smile. He touched the necklace gently and said, "This was my mother's. She gave it to me many years ago. It reminds me of her. That's why I always wear it." The attendant's eyes widened, and her breath caught. The weight of her mistake pressed down harder than ever. Suddenly, her comment about it being cheap or out of place seemed like the worst words she could have chosen. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again, her voice heavy with regret. "I didn't know." Keanu nodded slowly. Most people don't know. But that's the thing, isn't it? We never know what something means to someone else. That's why kindness matters. Always. Those words hit her harder than any scolding ever could. They weren't spoken with anger. They were spoken with wisdom, with truth. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes sting slightly, but she quickly blinked back the tears. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "And thank you for being so gracious, even after what I said." Keanu gave her another gentle smile and nodded. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. "What matters is what we learn from them." She stood there for a moment longer, then quietly stepped away, her heart filled with both relief and humility. She had been forgiven, but more importantly, she had been taught a lesson she would never forget. As she returned to the galley, her senior colleague looked at her knowingly. The younger attendant nodded slightly, as if to say, "You were right. I understand now." Meanwhile, the passengers who had overheard the exchange were touched. A few smiled at Keanu, one even giving him a small nod of respect. It wasn't just about the necklace anymore. It was about the way he carried himself with patience, kindness, and dignity. The rest of the flight passed quietly, but the atmosphere felt different. The story of the necklace had spread softly among the passengers. They no longer saw it as an ordinary chain but as a treasure, a piece of love kept alive. And in their minds, Keanu Reeves had proven once again why he was admired, not for his fame, not for his wealth, but for his heart. The flight attendant, though still embarrassed, felt lighter. She realized she had been given a second chance, not through words of anger, but through an example of humility. That kind of lesson, she knew, would stay with her long after the flight was over. At one point, as she passed by his seat again, Keanu gave her a reassuring smile. It wasn't forced, it wasn't formal, it was genuine. It said, "It's over. Let's move forward." She smiled back, her heart warmed by the simple kindness. As the hours drew closer to landing, passengers began to stir again, adjusting their seats and preparing for arrival. The cabin filled with soft chatter and the rustling of bags. But one story lingered quietly among them, shared in whispers, the story of a necklace, a careless comment, and a lesson in respect. Keanu, still calm and quiet, leaned back and closed his eyes for a short rest. His necklace rested gently against his chest, glowing faintly in the dim light. To him, it was a reminder of love. To everyone else on that flight, it had become a reminder of humility and kindness. The young attendant sat in her jump seat during landing, her mind still replaying the day. She thought of how she had entered the flight confident and carefree, only to learn one of the most important lessons of her career, that every person carries unseen stories, and respect is the best service anyone can give. The engines roared as the plane descended, and the city lights below grew brighter. The journey was almost over, but for those in first class, the memory of what had happened would travel with them long after they stepped off the plane. And for the flight attendant, the regret of her words had been replaced by something greater, a promise to never judge again, and to always remember that sometimes, the simplest things carry the deepest meaning. The plane began its gentle descent, cutting through layers of white clouds as the city lights below slowly came into view. Passengers adjusted their seats, buckled their belts, and prepared themselves for landing. The long flight was coming to an end, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed the events in first class, the memory of what happened would not fade so easily. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in his window seat, looking out at the sparkling lights below. His expression was calm, almost thoughtful, as if he was reflecting on something far beyond the journey itself. The necklace rested against his chest, unmoved by the turbulence, carrying with it a story too personal for most to understand. The younger flight attendant sat in her jump seat, her mind still replaying everything from earlier. She remembered her words, her mistake, her apology, and his gentle forgiveness. She had walked into the flight thinking she understood people just by looking at them, but she was leaving with a deeper truth. Appearances were only the surface. What lay beneath was always more important. As the wheels touched the runway with a soft thud, passengers clapped quietly, relieved to arrive safely. The cabin filled with the familiar noises of landing, the slowing engines, the movement of bags, and the excited chatter of travelers ready to continue their journeys. Yet, among all these sounds, a quiet respect lingered in the air. People weren't just leaving with memories of the flight, they were leaving with a story to share. When the plane finally came to a stop, the seat belt signs clicked off, and passengers began standing to retrieve their belongings. Keanu remained seated, waiting patiently for others to move first. This small act did not go unnoticed. In a world where many first-class passengers rushed to be the first out, here was a man who waited, who let others go before him, even though he was the most famous person on the flight. The flight attendant, still nervous but more at peace, approached him one last time. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "thank you again. I'll never forget this flight." Keanu looked at her with that same gentle expression and replied, "Neither will I remember, it's the little things that often mean the most." Her eyes softened. She nodded, and in that moment, she knew she would carry his words for the rest of her career and perhaps her life. As passengers began to exit, a few stopped by Keanu's seat to offer kind words. One older woman leaned over and said, "Your mother must have been very proud of you." Keanu smiled warmly, touched by the comment, and simply replied, "I hope so." Another passenger, a young man in a business suit, shook his head in admiration. "I've met many people in first class, but none like you," he said. Keanu only smiled and replied, "Thank you. Safe travels." It was these small exchanges that painted a picture of his character more clearly than any movie ever could. Here was a man who carried himself with grace, who wore his memories close, and who never let pride overshadow kindness. When Keanu finally stood and gathered his single bag, he walked down the aisle like any other traveler. No entourage, no flashing cameras, just a man leaving a flight quietly. But behind him, he left a story that passengers would tell again and again, the day a simple necklace taught everyone about humility and respect. The younger flight attendant, standing near the door to say goodbye to passengers, felt her chest tighten as he approached. For a moment, she thought of apologizing again, but Keanu stopped her with just a look and a smile. "Take care," he said warmly, his voice calm and steady. She nodded, holding back the emotions swirling inside her. After he left, she stood silently for a moment, the busy stream of passengers moving past her. She realized how rare it was to meet someone who could teach such a powerful lesson without raising his voice, without showing anger, and without seeking revenge. His kindness had been his response, and that was something she would never forget. Later that night, after the flight had ended and she sat alone in her apartment, she found herself thinking about the necklace again. She thought about how quick she had been to judge, how quick she had been to comment on something she didn't understand. And then she thought about his words, "We never know what something means to someone else. That's why kindness matters. Always." She realized those words didn't just apply to jewelry or objects. They applied to everything. Every person carried stories, memories, and silent struggles. A smile, a necklace, a quiet gesture, these things could hold the deepest meaning. And unless you knew the story, you had no right to judge. From that day forward, she promised herself that she would approach her work differently. She would treat every passenger with the same respect, no matter how they looked or what they wore. She would remember that service was not just about food and drinks, it was about kindness, empathy, and understanding. The story didn't stay inside the plane for long. Passengers who had witnessed the incident shared it with friends and family. Some posted about it online, writing how they had seen Keanu Reeves treated unfairly, only for him to respond with such dignity that it humbled everyone around him. The story spread quickly, admired by thousands, and once again, people were reminded why Keanu Reeves was loved not just as an actor, but as a human being. The flight attendant herself read some of those posts in the days that followed. Her name was not mentioned, but she knew the world was talking about her mistake. Strangely, instead of feeling crushed by embarrassment, she felt grateful. The story had reached far beyond the cabin, and maybe, just maybe, it would teach others the same lesson it had taught her. And what about Keanu? He continued with his life, as he always did, quietly, humbly, without making a fuss. For him, the necklace remained what it had always been, a reminder of his mother's love, a piece of his past carried into the present, and a symbol of the values she had taught him. To the world, it became a story of humility. To him, it was simply his way of keeping her close. The flight might have ended, but the lesson never did. For every passenger who saw what happened, the memory stayed alive. They remembered how quickly a joke could become a wound, how easily appearances could deceive, and how powerfully kindness could heal. In the end, it wasn't a movie scene, it wasn't scripted, and it wasn't staged. It was real life, a quiet reminder that dignity is not shown in how loudly someone speaks, but in how gracefully they act when tested. And so, the story of a necklace on a simple flight became something much larger. It became a reflection on humanity, on respect, and on the small but meaningful choices we make every day. Keanu Reeves walked off that plane just as he had walked on, humble, calm, and carrying nothing more than his bag and his necklace. But he left behind something invisible yet unforgettable, a lesson that would live in the hearts of many, long after the wheels had touched the ground.